You just heard the reading today. If you looked at and you follow the Revised Common Lectionary, you'll notice this is the first reading. It's not taken from the Gospel, it's taken from the book of Acts, which is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. If you put those two together, they form the longest narrative in the New Testament. And really, they should be read together. In the order that was later chosen by others, the fourth gospel was put between Luke and Acts, which is a little unfortunate in my opinion, but I understood why they did it. Luke, or the author of Luke Acts, wrote in 2 volumes. We get our word volume from the older word for scroll. It's very likely the length of Luke and the book of Acts, which are very similar to one another in length when you compare the two, very likely have the length they do because they were both originally written on separate scrolls. 2-volume work, we might say today. So I wanted to follow up today after last week where we read from Luke's version of the resurrection story to see what took place in his narrative after the resurrection in Jerusalem following the day of Pentecost. We haven't celebrated Pentecost yet in our year, but this jumps ahead a little bit to a story which gives us some insight into the way the author tries to defend Christianity, the early Christian movement, against those who were dismissing it. Why would they dismiss it, especially among the non-Jewish world? Well, we believe Jesus was killed as a result of an unholy alliance between political power and religious power. Specifically, the Sadducean-led Jewish council in Jerusalem collaborated with Pontius Pilate. Luke tells us Pontius Pilate tried to avoid this, but ultimately capitulated to their demands to have Jesus crucified. So you see a blend there of a religious majority and a political power resulting in the death of Jesus. But as far as the Roman Empire was concerned and the Greek and Roman world of the Mediterranean, when Christianity spread out into that area, it had a major obstacle to overcome. I talked about this on Maundy Thursday service a little bit, but let me refresh for those of you who weren't here. Jesus had a bad reputation. He had the reputation across the Roman Empire of being a criminal. More specifically, an insurrectionist who was trying to lead a rebellion against the local authority that Rome had installed. So therefore, he was charged with and convicted of being an insurrectionist leading a rebellion, and that's why he was crucified. Pilate had put above his head on the cross the superscription, "The King of the Jews." The King of the Jews was the charge against him. By assuming that role, he was in defiance of Rome. By the time Luke Acts is written, 2 major events have happened. Number one, in the year 30 of the Common Era, otherwise known as 30 AD, Jesus was crucified and as an insurrectionist leading a rebellion. So as far as the Greek and Roman world of the Mediterranean Sea Basin was concerned, he was a criminal who tried to defy Rome. In addition to that, Luke writes, the author of Luke Acts writes, some, 50 years or more after the time of these events, and in that intervening period, something else has happened that was a major deal. And that was the Jewish-Roman War, which began in 66 CE and ended in 73 of the Common Era. And right in the middle of that time, the year 70, Rome surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Ultimately, the city gave up. Rome destroyed the city, tore the temple down, except for a small part of what's still called the Wailing Wall today, and basically wiped out Jerusalem as a city. So across the Roman Empire, by the time the author of Luke Acts writes, he's got to overcome 2 different obstacles. First of all, the idea that the founder of this new faith was a criminal, an insurrectionist who was leading a rebellion against Rome and was crucified for that. By the way, the Romans reserved crucifixion not for the common everyday criminal, but primarily for the criminal they saw as an assault against someone who was trying to undermine the authority of Rome. And it was only reserved for non-Romans. And crucifixion was not simply about killing someone. Crucifixion was about more than that. Crucifixion was a billboard. It served as a billboard. The Roman Empire says, don't mess with us. This is what happens to people who rebel against the emperor. So Jesus has that reputation. The Jews also have a negative reputation across the Roman Empire, especially among non-Jews, because of the rebellion. And Galilee is associated with the rebellion because Judas the Galilean, which Gamaliel mentions, was one of the early insurrectionists and rebels that Rome had killed back in AD 6 of the Common Era. And Jesus just happened to be from where? The Galilee. So you see, we miss this if we're not careful. The author of Luke Acts is writing Luke Acts not only to tell the story of Jesus to the individual he calls most excellent Theophilus, he's also writing to try to defend Christianity against the charges that it really was a faith founded in rebellion against Rome by a Jew from Galilee. There's a lot of problems to overcome. So it's important when you read through Luke Acts to notice these things and to notice how the story is told. In this episode today we'll look at, Luke is primarily doing two things. First of all, he's trying to show once again that Jesus and his earliest followers were innocent of the charges of being insurrectionist rebels. And secondly, he's doing something else that he does throughout Luke Acts. He's discrediting the Jewish authorities for persecuting not only Jesus, but his followers. He's really saying this was not Jesus or his followers about, it's those Judean leaders who were really, the ones that were involved in that rebellion some years ago. They're the ones really to blame, not this budding faith we call Christianity. So with that in mind, I want us to look at this story. But I want to look at the story, but I want to also visit the 21st century again and talk to you about why this story gives us another good reason why it's important to defend religious freedom for all, and how that religious minorities should especially receive protection. And that's important in our world today. As I talked about during the time of prayer, we've seen in just recent weeks, and certainly in recent years, how that religious minorities can sometimes be targeted by governments, but also by other religious forces who seek to destroy them and eliminate them in the simple effort to peacefully worship God as they understand God. And I want to revisit that subject before I leave today. But let's look at this story. The Jewish council in Jerusalem, led by the Sadducean priestly family, and the names are listed in Acts chapter 4, Annas, Caiaphas, John, and Alexander, were offended that the disciples of Jesus preached his resurrection and blamed them for having killed him. They were involved in the death of Jesus. Who are the Sadducees? I grew up in very conservative churches, and they always told me the Sadducees were the Jewish liberals of the day. They weren't. They were actually the conservatives, religiously speaking. The Sadducean party were really dominated by a family at this time. I just gave you some of their names. Annas and Caiaphas especially. They dominated the Jewish high council. The Sadducean party were an older conservative group. They were wealthy aristocratic landowners. They'd used their great wealth and influence even with Rome to buy up more land. Matter of fact, one of the economic issues that Jesus attacked in his time was the way that wealthy aristocratic landowners who were well placed politically were essentially keeping the people the regular peasant people of both Judea and Galilee underfoot by basically only employing them as day laborers. Day laborers. Jesus, one of the things he critiques is the way wealthy and powerful people stack the deck against those who are impoverished and poor. The Sadducean party were the chief offenders in this group. They didn't believe in resurrection from the dead. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in demons. They didn't believe in a lot of the supernatural elements that emerged from the prophetic writings of the Hebrew scriptures. They believed only in the Torah as authoritative source of information about God and about their faith. The Sadducean party dominated the Jewish high council. It's important to know this, that in Jerusalem and Judea, they had much of the control. Now, they always had to please the emperor or the emperor's representative, like Pontius Pilate, the local governor. But by and large, Pilate and his people, Roman troops, stayed in Caesarea Maritima down on the Mediterranean coast. They only came to Jerusalem during the high holy days because of fear that things might get out of hand. But the Sadducean party led the council. They had a temple police. They were the temple police that arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The captain and the temple police play a prominent role in this story today. They don't like the fact that after the story of Jesus' resurrection and after the day of Pentecost, the disciples, led by Peter, the apostles, begin to go out and proclaim that Jesus is alive. That offends the Sadducees anyway, because they theologically believe it's bad theology. People don't rise from the dead. That's the older conservative view, by the way. But furthermore, there was another thing that offended them, the fact that they were blaming his death on them. See, the Sadducees thought they were just preserving the status quo. They thought they were doing a good thing by having Jesus killed. After all, he'd come there riding into the city on the back of a donkey, where people were celebrating him as the king of the Jews. He had gone into the temple and he had turned over the table to the money changer, because you understand the Sadducean party not only controlled politics for the most part in Jerusalem and Judea, but they also controlled the religious establishment in Jerusalem and Judea. And furthermore, the temple had become a de facto banking system, the financial system for the Jewish people in the land. So Jesus goes into the temple and he basically thumbs his nose at the political, the religious, and the financial center of the Jewish religion, the Jewish people. And the Sadducean-led Sanhedrin says, we got to do something about this guy. So they bring a bunch of charges against him, namely insurrection and rebellion against Rome. And they turn him over to Pilate, and they pressure him, at least according to Luke. Pilate's pressured to crucify Jesus, and so he's killed. But now his followers are saying he's alive, and they killed him, the Sadducean-led high council. That would bother me too if I were one of them. But they have every right to be bothered. Because, they did kill Jesus, or at least they manipulated the circumstances where Pilate would kill him. But they don't like it. So what do? Well, they have the apostles arrested. And they warn them, you need to stop doing this. Don't do this anymore. Strictly do not speak about resurrection in Jesus' name anymore. And they let them go. But what do? What did the apostles do? They went right back at it, proclaiming Jesus is alive, and the Jewish high council killed him. So what do? Well, they went out and they had the temple captain and the temple police arrest the apostles again. And they put them in jail. And overnight, we're told in the narrative, an angel releases them, frees them from jail. Now, that's a particularly galling story, because the Sadducean-controlled Sanhedrin didn't believe in angels either. So when the temple guard goes back to find the apostles and the jail's empty, it says they're perplexed. They don't know what's going on here. So what do? Well, they send for them again, because guess where the apostles are? They're right back out there in the streets of Jerusalem, as they say, filling the city with their doctrine, with their teaching. And so they arrest him again, and they bring him before, it says, the entire body of the elders. That is, all the elders of the Jewish high council are brought together, and they bring the apostles, led by Peter, in the midst of them, and they are not happy with them. They've told them over and over again, they've arrested them multiple times to stop saying these things about Jesus and about them. And how does Peter respond? Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than any human authority." And this does not make them happy at all. It says that the council becomes enraged. They want to kill them. One of the members of the high council, named Gamaliel. You may be familiar with Gamaliel because later on in the book of Acts, we're told that when Saul of Tarsus, better known as Paul the Apostle, when he gives his own resume, he says that I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. In other words, he had studied under the leadership of Gamaliel. And so Gamaliel, who is not incidentally, a Pharisee who believes in resurrection and in angels and demons, he says, "No, don't kill these men." And he gives a speech. Now, it's an interesting speech. And it's a speech that clearly the author kind of made up. Okay? You say, how do you know that? Because there's an important historical point that he gives. In Gamaliel's speech, while giving a defense of the early apostles and then preaching about Jesus, he cites two movements that were historical movements. One was Judas of Galilee, who had led a rebellion and failed. Another individual by the name of Theudas, who had led another group of people out in rebellion, who had also failed. The problem is, historically, is that when Gamaliel said this, the Theudas incident was still about 10, maybe 15 years away in the future. You say, well, how in the world does he have Gamaliel mention Theudas and his rebellion and his failure 10 years in the future? Does Gamaliel just know it's going to happen someday? No, he reports it has already happened. Well, it's simple. The author of Luke Acts writes this well after both events have occurred, and so when he crafts his speech, he maybe doesn't know correctly the history, and he puts it in Gamaliel's mouth. But either way, Gamaliel, who is well known to the storyline of the book of Acts, gives a speech, a compelling speech apparently. It says, leave these men alone. If what they're doing is not from God, it'll fail just like these other two that he names. But if it is of God, then you find yourselves fighting against God. This shows you, and comes up again in the book of Acts, the inner dynamic of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high council, some of whom were Sadducees, who believed in resurrection from the dead, who didn't believe in resurrection of the dead, and some were Pharisees who did. So there's inner tension within this group. Later on, Paul, the apostle, plays on this inner tension in his own arrest. So it says, the high council decide that Gamaliel's given a good speech. So what do? They warn the apostles that they must stop preaching about Jesus and the resurrection, or else. And they flog them, and they let them go. End of story, right? No. They go right back out in the city streets and keep on preaching that Jesus is alive, and the Jewish high council, at least some of them, had the role in having him killed. So what does this story teach us? Well, what Luke, the author of Luke's gospel, wants us to know is that once again, Jesus and his early followers are exonerated. At least there were voices within the group that shows that this is really just an inter-Jewish squabble, not something that's a threat against Rome. So that's something that Luke wants Theophilus to know. But he also wants to take another dig at the Sanhedrin-led high council, who they believed were responsible for having Jesus killed. But I want to back away from what Luke was concerned about and bring us to the 21st century. This story is another reminder to us of how bad an idea it is to intertwine religion and governmental authority. And if you look at human history, you'll see how common it has been for religious majorities to go to political and governmental authorities and intertwine themselves for their own preferred position and status, and then look down upon religious minorities and try to oppress them in one way or another. This is just another example of that idea and how bad it is. We've seen it throughout history. Fortunately, we live in a country. We haven't always lived up to our ideals, but we live in a country, in the United States, where we say right there in our Constitution, in the very first amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Religious freedom is guaranteed to us as a constitutionally protected right, rooted in the idea that a forced faith is no good. That if you can force someone through governmental power or simply the pressure of the majority into some sort of mental, spiritual conformity, that isn't authentic anyway. It's of no value. Furthermore, to attack peaceful, non-threatening people who simply want to worship God as they understand God is not only a horrible sin, it's immoral, but it should be illegal. We take for granted today that we're here in this place, and I'm not worried about the police department coming in and breaking up what we're doing here and hauling me off to jail. I know Sheriff Judd's not going to do it. He may be in church this morning himself. We live in a world where we take this for granted, but I'll tell you what, whether it's Egypt or Sri Lanka or sometimes, in countries, Russia, just one of Vladimir Putin's many sins is that he's formed an unholy alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, and they're persecuting religious minorities in Russia. They are. You can go around the globe. You can find a lot of places in the world where people can't take for granted that they have the freedom to speak out loud about what they believe about God. This story is just one example. Of all people, followers of Jesus should be at the forefront of religious freedom for all people. Our own Lord, Jesus Christ himself, died as a result of one of these unholy alliances. So when it comes to religious freedom, we should always insist. We should insist, and we should stand for, and we should speak out against those who would like to use government power to privilege their own religion above everyone else's. Furthermore, we should expect political authorities to protect the religious freedom of all people. And even those in political power and in office, we should remind them to be careful about not giving the impression that your faith somehow should be privileged over everybody else's. This is, by the way, why we discourage, for example, in our public education system, we strongly don't just discourage it, we expect that our classroom teachers and the administrators of the school not try to make their own personal faith the official faith of that school. Now, individual teachers and individual administrators have the freedom to go out and worship God as they choose and in their own time, in their private lives, to advocate strongly for whatever faith they believe in. But when they're in those unique positions of authority over children, they're not to try to use it as a subtle way to simply further their own narrow views about God. There are good reasons why we do that. Not this notion that you sometimes hear out there from sometimes the good Christians that we're trying to attack Christianity. No, we're not trying to attack Christianity. We're trying to preserve its integrity by not using government authority to simply prop it up. I want a free market in religious ideas. As long as people do not use force or fraudulent behavior to compel people to join their faith, they should be free to advocate whatever they believe about God to others. Simple as that. The best way to counter a bad religious idea is with a better one, not by calling in the cops to intervene and haul them away, because you don't agree with them. And I believe that's true in the world, and we ought to pray and we ought to work for making sure our society continues to reflect those values. But when we look around the world, we should influence our political policy makers to try to influence other governments to protect the religious freedom of all people wherever they may be and whoever they may be. And I don't want to put my thumb on the scale simply for Christians. I want it for everybody. Sometimes it gets under my skin a little bit. You know, there are religious minorities all over the world who are being persecuted, sometimes by government, sometimes the government's turning a blind eye to people, forces within their society who are doing it. It galls me a little bit that when I hear our public officials, they only want to talk about Christians being persecuted. Well, I don't want Muslims persecuted. I don't want Jews persecuted. I don't want Hindus. I don't want Buddhists. I don't want atheists. I want people to be free. And I think it's very important that we, in our own minds, reaffirm these principles, and we have the opportunity to influence those who are policymakers. I believe, and I recommend to you, that we should always take the side of religious freedom for all. Religious liberty for everybody. Because a forced faith is no good. And Jesus is a testimony to us of how individuals can get caught and destroyed by the unholy alliance between the religious authority and governmental authority. Let's work for a better world where people don't have to worry about that.